Okay, let's get into the program a little bit. I'm going to try to make this next part go a little fast because, again, I need to introduce a few things just in case you're completely have no understanding of SuperCollider. Basically, you'll open the program. It'll open in this window. The program is itself, the code is in this window here. Up here is the reference section where you can look up different terms within SuperCollider and learn about the program if you actually want to, or learn about SuperCollider, I should say. Here you've got your debug window, which just posts lines that you can create debug lines and post lines that spit out information from the program into this window here that you can see. I wouldn't really worry too much about that. You'll see different things kind of shooting by as the program runs. Depending on which iteration of this program I actually released, you may end up seeing different types of information show up here. It's not really anything to be worried about. It's just mostly there for my own use, and when I again release it, I'm not going to go through and really remove all my post lines, but they don't affect the actual functionality of the program at all, so don't worry too much about that. In terms of how to use it, you basically select all the code. In the case of Mac, Command A, and then to run it, you kind of use the menu, or I just usually do Shift Return, and then to stop it, you do Command period, and it will stop. If for some reason something happens that causes it to crash, it shouldn't crash under most circumstances, but if something happens, there are some values that you can put into variables which it won't like. For instance, if there's a looping rhythmic section and you put in only 0 for that, that is probably the most common thing that will cause it to freeze or crash on you, because it's basically it's looping, infinitely at an increment of 0 seconds, so it kind of causes it to spaz out a little bit. If for some reason that happens, you go up to the server menu, which is probably off my screen capture here, but it's up here, and you do kill all servers. That will usually bring it back. If not, you can just force quit the SuperCollider program. Hopefully you don't run into that, but you might. It's just kind of a nature of the beast here. In terms of how the program actually works, again, I alluded to the fact that the first 250 lines or so are all definitions. Stop around here, and then it gets into the actual code that causes everything to work. Then there's a little bit at the bottom here that I'll talk about. For the most part, unless you really want to get into this and work with the code, you're not going to be dealing with that. It's all how you define the definitions that cause it to make whatever music you want to make. So you're pretty much going to be interfacing with that first 250 lines. In terms of the formats of the definitions, the most common things you'll encounter are constant values, which is just, here's a variable here, BPM equals, and then whatever value you want to give it, in this case, 60 BPM. So it's just the variable equals number, semicolon. All lines have to end in semicolon. You will see that in things like here's mode select equals 0. In some cases, you'll have a variable like this where 0 equals off and 1 equals on. So here mode select is turned off. The other common type of value you'll see is a list, which here, as you can see, is very similar. It's just got brackets around it and commas between the numbers. So here's a list composed of 0, 3, and 5. You can add offsets to variables or other types of mathematical operations. So here you've got this entire list, and you're adding 60 to the entire list, which means it's going to add 60 to each of the elements. So for instance, the list actually has 0, 3, and 5, but really the effect that has is that this is really 60, 63, and 65. Here's another. You could also say, divided by 2 or something. So you could say divided by 2 or divided by 2 or multiplied by 2. So in that case, this would be 0, 6, and 10. So you can do that. There's also nested lists. So for instance, here we've got a bracket indicating that this is all a whole list, but within that list you have 2 other lists. So just kind of be aware of the format. So a list has brackets with commas in between, and then since this is a list, this is one value with a comma, one value with a comma, or well, just one comma because there's only 2, but you get the idea. And again, the offset will affect everything in here. So for instance, this is 55, really this is 57, 58, and so forth. In terms of what the numbers actually mean, the most common 2 types of data in this program are pitch information and time information or durations. The pitch information is really in MIDI notes. So for instance, here again, this is really 60, 63, and 65. So this is MIDI note 60, MIDI note 63, and MIDI note 65. In terms of duration, I'll go down and show you an example of that. So these are really beats, and the beats again are defined by the tempo. So up here we have the tempo is currently at 60 beats per minute. So this is 2 beats at 60. This is 1 beat, 3 beats. So 1 is really a quarter note. 0.5 would be an 1/8 note. 0.25 would be a 16th note, and so forth. So hopefully that should be pretty easy to understand. In terms of numbering conventions within SuperCollider, there are some things where 0 will really indicate a 1, and that's when you're dealing with stuff that's sort of systemic to SuperCollider. For instance, the way it refers to MIDI channels when you're dealing with that, 0 is really channel 1. So in SuperCollider, the MIDI channels are 0 to 15, not 1 through 16. So just be aware of that. There aren't too many cases in which you encounter that in the program. They do exist, but I'll go over those at some point. I'll call attention to them, but just be aware of that. The other way in which that comes into play is when you're referencing elements within these lists, and there are certain variables that do that. Let me find one here. Sorry, here. So in this particular one, and again, I'll go over this later, but so this particular variable here actually references the indexes of notes, and then index is the number of the values in a list. So this is the first index, the second index, third index rather. So this would really be index 0, index 1, index 2. So just be aware of that as well. You can put in comments. These double slashes comment out a line. As you can see, I've commented out this line here. This is the kind of active version of this variable because it doesn't have comments. I find that useful as I'm using the program. I can just kind of, if I wanted to play around with a different version, like here I've got this set of values that I like, well, what if I wanted to try out something else? I would just comment that out and then create a new version of notes that had whatever else I wanted to try to do. So again, you might see when you get this version of this program, you might see that I've got different commented versions that aren't active, like this isn't active right now, this isn't active right now, neither is this. Oh, well, this is just a comment. So I'll try to remove those just so they don't get cumbersome and confusing, but just be aware that that's what those are for. So pretty easy to use overall. This section up here is just an init section. Essentially, it finds your MIDI devices and in this case selects which one it should be using. Hopefully you shouldn't have any trouble with that. If for some reason it's not finding the correct device, that will obviously cause it not to work. You might have to look up how to really deal with this. I'm not going to go over this again. This is not really a SuperCollider tutorial, but I'm just trying to get, some basic idea of how to use the program for people who don't have a ton of experience with this. So yeah, that should get you started, and there are other things that will come up, but I'll go over those as they appear.